Hey, you guys. We are today talking about niches and community interactions. So if we look at the hierarchy of our ecological organization, if you remember that it started out the most basic, meaning the fewest pieces, we talked about in an ecosystem is the organism. So that's a single living thing. And then we talked about populations. So that's multiple or many of the single living things or many of the living things within an area. And so now we're talking about communities, which is how populations interact. So different populations interacting. This is where we are. And to talk about this, we're going to look at some emperor penguins and cacti. So organisms need to live somewhere. And where they live is determined by the range of conditions that they can live and grow in. So the conditions that a penguin can live and grow in is going to be different than the conditions that a cacti can grow and live in. So a penguin is going to be living in obviously much colder temperatures. It's going to have a lot more feathers, and it's going to have blubber, and it swims. Its whole body is made for swimming. It has a streamlined body, which allows it to swim quickly through the water. It would not survive very long in the hot desert. It would overheat. And so based on abiotic factors, things like temperature, humidity, if you're living in the water, the pH of the water, that's going to determine where organisms live, is the abiotic factors. And so even within that, in that one area, so if we're talking about emperor penguins in Antarctica, they live in that area because they can survive in a range of conditions. So let's talk about temperature. They can survive in a temperature range between -22 to about 5 degrees. If it gets much warmer than 5 degrees, they're going to overheat. If it gets much colder than -22 degrees, they're going to freeze to death. And so this is the range of conditions in which, or the range of temperature that a penguin, an emperor penguin, can survive. And so we graph this, or we look at this on something that we call a range of tolerance. On the y-axis, we see that there's population size. So as you go up the y-axis, the population is getting larger. And here on the x-axis, you can see that we're looking at the temperature of which fish can survive. And so as we go further up, the temperature is getting warmer and warmer. If we look at this curve, if we look at the red line on this graph, you can see that it starts off that the population size is very small, and then it's non-existent. And as it gets warmer, the population is going to increase. It's going to increase. It's going to reach the zone of physiological stress. It's going to reach the optimum range. So right here, you can see the population is increasing. This is where the most number of fish can survive. So here, if we look at the temperature, let's say that the temperature of the water is, let's do something easy, like 50 to 60 degrees. So here at 55 degrees, this is the optimum range. This is where most of the fish are going to survive. But then it starts to get too warm, and the fish start to stress out. They can't reproduce. The young, the old die off, and there are fewer fish living here until it gets too warm, and then you've reached the zone of intolerance. So there's 3 different zones here. The optimum range, where you have the most number of species surviving. You have the zone of physiological stress, where organisms can survive, but just barely, and they can't reproduce there. There's just not enough energy. It takes all of their energy just to survive there. It's either too hot or too cold. And then you reach the zone of intolerance. And so this is called the range of tolerance. And it is the range of tolerance that determines an organism's habitat. Habitat is the general place where an organism lives. So the general place of the penguin, the emperor penguin, is Antarctica. And it's determined by its range of tolerance. What can it survive in? What are the abiotic factors that allow it to survive or not survive there? And so here, the cactus it has a range of tolerance. The amount of water or the temperature that is present there is going to determine whether this cactus can survive there. And so if an organism has a habitat, then it's going to have a job or a niche. So when we're looking at the word habitat, we can think of it as an organism's address. Where does it live? But if we look at its niche, we're looking at its job. This is what it does. So the niche is sort of like its job. And this is the way that a species obtains what it needs. It's usually associated with how it gets food. And if we look at this predator-prey, move this up a little bit. Let me make it small so I can show you the whole thing. Here we go. We have a predator-prey graph here of the snowshoe hare and a lynx. And so the job of a lynx is to keep the snowshoe hare population in check. And the job of the hare is to feed the lynx. And we can see this, how their niches are interacting, how they interact as a community, two different populations interacting. If you see here, the lynx population is going to increase. And when the lynx population increases, the hare population is going to decrease because there's more lynx eating hare. And so the lynx population is going to eventually go down. The lynx population is going to eat the hare. The hare population is then going to crash. It's going to go down. But then that's going to cause the lynx population to decrease because there's no hare left, or there's few hare left. And so if with few hare, the lynx are going to starve. They're not going to have enough energy to reproduce. And so the lynx population is going to go down. But when the lynx population goes down, well, that gives the hare population an opportunity to recover because there's fewer lynx eating the hare. And so their population is going to go up. But then this population, once it gets abundant again, well, that's going to feed many lynx. And so you can see that as after the hare population increased, the lynx population increased. And so you can see this sort of homeostasis of the population, how it's in a steady state. It's going up and down within a certain range, and the two depend on each other. And so this is a niche. This is how niches interact. And so when you have organisms in a community interacting, it often produces competition. That is when two organisms are pursuing the same resource. They both want something. If we look here, we have two polar bears interacting. And if you look here, we have a groundhog and some birds. And this is two different types of competition. We have intraspecific competition. That means that you have two of the same types of organisms or within the same species competing. And if you have interspecific competition, this means that you have organisms from two different species interacting. So here, the two polar bears, these are probably two male polar bears, and they are probably fighting for territory. They're fighting for dominance to see who's more dominant and who's going to have access to the territory. Because if if one wins, then it's going to have access to the territory, which means it's going to have access to females to reproduce and all of the food that's in that area so that it can survive long enough to reproduce and pass on its DNA to an offspring. And so you'll oftentimes see males competing. This will be intraspecific competition for territory so that they can survive and reproduce and pass on their genes. You have interspecific competition. This is between two different species. And you can remember this by the fact that since it's two different species, if you are driving on the interstate, that means that you are driving through different states. It'll take you through two, three different states. And so interspecific competition is going to be between two different species. What I want you to do is I want you to watch the video here and answer the questions that are on your notes. And I will talk to you guys later. Have a great day.